Hello, everybody. This is Adel Al-Saleh, certainly in a very unique circumstances. Last year in Hannover Messe, I did a big presentation in a big auditorium with many people, a lot of interconnections, a lot of buzz, a lot of noise. And now I'm in an empty auditorium, of course, with my camera crew, demonstrating the new reality. This is where we're living today. And today what I want to talk to you about is how do you actually accelerate out of the environment we're in today to drive your business, to drive the improvement of your business, to get back to where your business were before the crisis and actually get it better than what it was. And I want to talk to you about the different phases that companies go through, as well as some of the big imperatives that I believe are important to us as we go forward transforming the companies through this very different world that we live in. Now, we believe companies go through three phases in these kind of crises. And they are, of course, driven, these phases, by the economical unrest that we have experienced over the last few years. And you have seen the impact on many different companies. And my chart here shows, first of all, what's happened to the IT sector, the technology sector. The technology sector has been one of the most resilient sectors over the last 10 years. And as you can see, even that sector has not been experiencing good times in this COVID environment. Big impacts on share prices, big impacts on equity values of these companies. But more important is to think about what happened to the industries. And the impact on the industries varies, but everybody felt the pain. So if you look at telecommunications industry, it's the one probably the most resilient that's demonstrated stability through this crisis. When you think about healthcare, that became the most important industry for us over the last few months, had a drop in their economic activity and their equity values. If you look at banking, minus 18%, retail, automotive manufacturing, and if you look at travel, transport, and logistics, you see the biggest impacts. So the reality is everybody is feeling the pain. From the most secure industries, from the most resilient industries, to the day-to-day industries that we use in our day-to-day lives. So how do you emerge? So let me get back to these three different phases that we go through. Phase number one, we call it secure yourself in a current mode of operation. So what happened at the end of March? What happened was that everybody raced to secure their employees. So we all started thinking, how do we get the employees home? How do we make sure they're secure? How do we make sure that they have the equipment they need? How do we make sure they're connected? How do we make sure our business operations continue? Of course, the manufacturing sector, who had to close manufacturing lines, had a big hit. But still, how do I keep my supply chain going? How do I make sure I secure when I get back to work? How do I get into a social distancing manufacturing? All that was about securing the business. And you realize through that phase that you are super adaptable. And we have so many examples of companies doing things that were unique, fast, new, that we couldn't think possible before the crisis. I'll give you a few examples. If you think about us, we had a few areas where we had to build a new data center, put up a new data center, not physically create the brick and mortar, but put up a new data center over a weekend. When we had to enable thousands of VPNs over a few days. When we had to increase the bandwidth of our network in several hours. We have examples where hospitals have to put new hospital locations, including ICUs, within a month. All that compared to old ways of doing things, which would take us months, quarters, sometimes years. So we found ourselves to be super adaptable. And I will come back to that point as we go forward. But that is just about securing our operations and make sure that we're working well. Second phase is all about adapting to this new normal. So how do we now sustain ourselves? That's the phase that many companies had to go through to figure out, okay, the urgency and the emergency dynamics that I just went through, now how do I make sure that I continue to work like this over the foreseeable future? How do I make sure that the speed and the agility that I have learned over the last, that I demonstrated over the last several weeks and several months, I sustain going forward? How do I make sure that the things that disrupted me, like my supply chains, like my partnerships, how do I make sure I get back to that and I secure that on a longer period of time? And I have a great example that we have experienced ourselves as Deutsche Telekom through that period adapting to this new normal. And that is basically the Corona Warn App. The Corona Warn App is the most successful application in German history. And the complexity of that project was not writing the code. It was not the application. It was not the software engineering. It was all of the stakeholders that had to work together in a new way. I remember the call receiving from the government saying, we need your help, working with SAP to partner together to deliver this app that to date struggled in getting to the market. We had to put the team together. We had to work with many different stakeholders, different ministries within the federal government. We had to work with Robert Koch Institute, with Fraunhofer, with different third parties that were critical part of the solution. And we did it in an agile way. And what was critical to understand is it wasn't just about writing the code. It was actually about digitizing the testing processes, getting the results to the end users, and creating the code that brings it all together in a cohesive way. A highly integrated solution that our stakeholders needed in the marketplace. Of course, what brought us all together was the social responsibility to do this for Germany. That was the driver. That was the rallying cry across these teams. But we worked in an agile way. We had scrums, we had agile coaches, we had stand-ups, we have broken up the tasks into different digestible periods where we would do our development, and we did it as a team in a very cohesive way. And that, by the way, does not stop. The reality, there are a lot more iterations, a lot more functionality, a lot more capabilities that we need to build. Like, for example, interoperability across Europe. You know, people are traveling across the borders now. How do we make sure all of these different applications across Europe talk to each other? Improving the Bluetooth measurement dynamics, creating more accurate risk assessments. And of course, it's about monitoring the general pandemic dynamics that could be helpful for the Ministry of Health to drive different actions to contain these pandemics today and in the future. So this is an example of adapting to the new normal. The reason I bring that up, we're super proud of this app, of course, but not to talk about the app, but how we work differently and how do we need to sustain it going forward. This is about getting comfortable in the new normal and adjusting to it and then making sure you repeat it. Now, the third phase is about how do we accelerate digitization? How do we move forward out of this crisis? And in this phase, it's about accelerating all of the things that we've been talking about. Digitizing our supply chains, making sure that we have new processes, making sure that we're deploying the latest technologies, making sure that it's data-driven decisions, making sure we use advanced analytics and AI in order to be able to drive intelligence into our way of working. That is now the need for us to accelerate. And in this cycle of the crisis, we learned a few things. One of the things we've learned, as an example, was that the way we built our companies, regardless whether we were a local provider or a global provider, was based on highly optimized supply chains. And in most cases, these supply chains were highly dependent on two nations. Close to 50% of all manufacturing supply chains are dependent on either China or United States. 28% on China and 16% on United States. We learned very quickly that this highly optimized supply chains actually have a lot of weak points. One point of failure in that supply chain brought the entire chain down. And that is something we need to address as we go forward. We learned that dependency is now something that we need to think about and redesign how we drive our business solutions going forward. So what do we do next, right? How do we actually address those learnings, and how do we accelerate digitization? Well, the first thing we advise is, coming back to the supply chain, is we have to rethink these supply chains. And there's a lot of geopolitical movements around the world that actually drive nationalistic thinking and behaviors and drive the pressure on the businesses to reconfigure these supply chains. So going from a highly optimized global supply chains, now we're thinking about how do we glocalize these supply chains? How do I make sure I have redundancy? How do I make sure that I am able to run my business locally without huge dependence on one, and have alternatives to be able to deliver my solutions and run my factories and deliver my products to the marketplace? That is the first priority that every company must be thinking about, not just the manufacturing companies, but actually many of the companies in the world. The other thing that we need to think about is all of these discussions we've had about Industry 4.0 and digitization of the factory now needs to become a reality. So it's no longer about this long-term planning and discussions about what does Industry 4.0 look like. It's about making it real. And I'll come back to that in a couple of minutes to discuss actually how do you do that? How do you do that in this new environment as we go forward? So then, how do we make all of this happen? It's easy to say those things, being very generic about it. How do we actually accomplish these changes that I talked about? And how do we accelerate digital now in our businesses? Well, look, one thing for sure is you can't do the same thing you used to do before and expect different answers or different outcomes. And it's a very famous saying by Albert Einstein that I believe in. Don't keep doing the same thing and expect different outcomes. So we have to do something different. So we advise on a couple of areas. One is, think about what is the new normal. And now it's in the context of your organization. How do you develop an organization that can operate in the new normal? And in Deutsche Telekom, we created this framework that we are actually evolving in. I wouldn't say we're ready to go and deploy it, but we are evolving. We're thinking about 6 different parameters within our organization, how to introduce this new normal. One is new ways of working. Second, it's about our work environment. Third, it's about our leadership and the leadership mindset. Fourth, it's about our people, and are they ready to work in these new environments? It's about the governance next, and of course, about organization and processes. And you have to think holistically, if you're trying to change your organization going forward, how to adapt to this new normal. And I'm going to pick 3 things to talk to you about within that framework of 6 areas. One is about new ways of working. And there's been a big debate within the industry of, okay, we've gone remote and digital, and productivity is great, and everything is okay, let's stay like that. Well, we don't believe that it's one or the other. I think we need to take the best of both worlds, digital and physical, and adapt it to the type of work we're doing. So we're going in Deutsche Telekom analyzing what work is best suitable to be done remotely. So for example, team meetings. Once a quarter, we've got to have a team meeting, once a month, or whatever the business requires. Well, that needs to be done physically. Innovation workshops, new development kickoff activities. All that makes sense to do in a physical environment. What about your daily tasks? What about your business reviews? Well, it's most likely that they can be done remotely. So we're going through categorizing different works that we do across the company to decide which one should be done in what manner. And we're giving our managers frameworks to think about how they deploy it. The second part about the work environment, if we're going to change how we work, our work environments need to adjust, because majority of our work environments today are configured for desk work. And of course, in our manufacturing, for our manufacturing work or distribution centers. If we're going to change how we work, if we start automating, if we start doing a lot of autonomous things, these workplaces have got to be reconfigured. and especially from a G&A function, from general and administration functions, if we're going to be asking people to work different ways, we need to reconfigure these offices to have more of these collaboration rooms and meeting rooms rather than desks across the organization. So we have to get smarter about how do we reconfigure our work environments as we go forward. And of course, the last one that I want to share with you is a lot of our leaders, majority of our leaders, are used to working in the old ways. Everything is physical, people travel, you have to have meetings, they have to be in person, physical, et cetera, et cetera. So we have to teach people how to work in a different environment, how to manage remote teams. How do you make sure you don't lose the connection? How do you make sure that you are physically, even if you're physically not connected, that mentally you're aligned and make sure that everybody knows what you're doing and driving the projects in a successful way? And there is an art to do that, and there's a science to do that. So we need to teach our leaders how to do that new way of leading, a new way of working. Now, of course, all these need to be adapted to the type of business you're in. Our manufacturing colleagues who run plants are not able to say, well, I'm just going to reconfigure my plant, or I can do it all remotely. But as we go through digitizing our factories, as we create more automation, as we create more autonomous manufacturing, actually, some of these jobs can be done remotely. And again, it's very specific to different environments, and I'd encourage all of you to think about, well, what does that really mean and how do I apply it? But it's important to think in that context, how do I get my organization to think about new things? The second thing I want to share with you is about a technology that enables us to drive more scalability, to drive more innovation, to bring our costs to different levels than what they were before, which is cloud. And one of the biggest winners in this crisis has been the adoption of cloud. And we are a big believer in that. So we believe that the old environments of our compute and store, where you had an integrated stack from hardware all the way to application, must evolve into modular, multi-cloud environments. And we need to be comfortable that we will have to manage this multi-cloud environments. But there are a few fundamental architectural points that I want to make. One is, you will have a multi-cloud environment from a private cloud, a hyperscaler, and a new form of cloud, what we call sovereign clouds. You need to decide what application is fit best for what environment. It's false to assume everything can go to the public cloud. There are applications who are highly optimized in a private cloud environment that maybe have a limited life cycle that should stay there and get optimized. Many of our loads are suitable for the public clouds, for the hyperscalers. So we need to decide which ones are these and how do we move them. And of course, there is this big momentum, that whole national geopolitical issue that I talked about, that is crying out for not being dependent on one or two vendors or Chinese vendors or American vendors in the future. How do I create a sovereign cloud for the loads that require that sovereignty? And that is something we will see emerging over the next 12 to 18 months. Now, all of these clouds need to be deployed in an open frame structure. We believe in an open environment, in a transparency, which is why we built the Corona Warn app in a totally transparent way. We actually listed all of our code in GitHub. So the management of these clouds needs to adopt that open framework. It needs to be based on containers, it needs to be based on open source, and it needs to be able to move loads between different environments. And the applications need to be able to be adapted based on the need of that application and move between different clouds. That's what we consider a multi-cloud environment, which is required for the industry. So that is an important point as an enabler as we go forward into the future. Now then, how do we apply these things into the smart factory? And we've been talking about this now for many months and many quarters of what does a smart factory mean from a Deutsche Telekom perspective. Well, we think the smart factory is connected. It uses the latest broadband technology, whether it's 5G or it is the broadband technologies to bring that foundation of digitization. It replaces the highly optimized supply chains into value chains that connects the company together and creates flexibility and not dependency on one or two suppliers. It uses the latest technology that gives it data-driven business decisions in the future. And this is what we say now. Now is the time to really get serious about deploying that smart factory of the future. Now it's the time to need the factory to be designed to make it flexible, to make it configurable. And we had a few examples over the crisis period where factories actually did that. We've seen manufacturing plants convert themselves to produce PEP, to produce ventilators. So we already had examples where factories actually can do those things, but how do we do it at scale and not in a crisis mode is what we're talking about. And for us in Deutsche Telekom, we think about enabling this transformation in the factory through four very important pillars. The first pillar is connectivity. How do you provide the required connectivity into the factory that allows it to build digitization on top of that? Of course, we're talking about 5G campus networks, but we're also talking about broadband technologies that give you that capability in the factory and gives you the flexibility to evolve the factory in the future. Second, it's about leveraging the digital and system integration capabilities that we have built over many, many years to convert your applications and use cases into new formats, into digital formats. Third, it's about leverage of the cloud infrastructure in a multi-cloud architecture that I described earlier. And of course, finally, you have to keep security as part of your key design criteria as you go forward. So that is super important for us to build that. So we have these four pillars that are available to our customers and our partners in order to start their journey and start that journey fast. But there are two other aspects that I want to talk about that are as important as technology, as important as the building blocks that we have across the organization, and that is the purpose of the organization and how do you deal with some of the social aspects of the world. Now, we in Deutsche Telekom have our purpose very clear, and that is we are not stopping until everybody's connected. And when we say connected, we're meaning it in a much broader sense, not just the network, but connecting machines to machine, computers, people, societies. We're talking about a real broad connectivity discussion to enable digitization. So the question to me is, do you have a purpose in the organization? And what are you doing about the social dynamics in our world? We've learned through the digital age that hate is still rampant, racism is still there, disadvantaged nations continue to struggle, and we in Deutsche Telekom decide that we need to be very clear where we stand. We stand about inclusion, dabei. We want everybody to take part in the evolution of the society. We condemn racism, we condemn hate, and we support giving an opportunity to everybody to prosper. And the companies that ignore the social outcries will see more and more challenges in their business models. There are great examples already today. Companies that are ignoring some of the social dynamics and are getting big impacts in their businesses already. So that's point number one. Do not ignore that in your company. You need to stand for something that you believe in as business leaders for your company. And the second is about sustainability. And this is not just about sustainability of your company, it's about sustainability for the world. And how do you contribute to that? We in Deutsche Telekom have adopted a clear position where we want to be contributing to the society when it comes to sustainability. And as an IT provider within Deutsche Telekom, we are seeing the dynamics clearly already. First, Our customers are beginning to ask us, so what are your plans in your sustainability? Our competitors are beginning to advertise and making it a competitive advantage. Our employees and our prospects who we're trying to recruit are asking us, what is your position in sustainability? And of course, the regulators are thinking about that. So there is no option but to take sustainability seriously to your business. And for us, we have declared our manifesto in Deutsche Telekom. And this manifesto, we want to make it better and better and better. But today, we have declared that by next year, in 2021, we're going to be 100% user of renewed energy. We will reduce our emissions by 90% by the end of 2030. And then by 2050, we will have net zero emissions for our company. And as I said, we continue to evolve that as technology becomes available, as we see new solutions to keep improving our position on sustainability. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your attention. Look, I hope you got something beneficial from this speech. I apologize we're not in front of each other. But if there are a few things to take away, is the following. One is, the crisis has taught us a lot of things. We've learned things that we didn't think we could do. One of the things that we actually realized is the way we've built our supply chains are not sustainable in those kind of crises. So we need to rethink that. We need to accelerate our digitization. You have to, right? You have to have a factory that is ready for these kind of crises and not lose any momentum as long as you have automation and capabilities in these factories. You need to think about, how do you transform? It's not just about technology, it's also about how do you change the way you work and how you configure your company going forward. And of course, do not forget about the social responsibility that you as a company need to bring to the people and the world. Thank you, and see you soon.